Well, I would like to welcome César Brioso to our Bud Metheny chapter meeting. César is a digital producer for USA Today Sports, where he formerly served as baseball editor in his 30 years as a sports journalist. He also has written for the Miami Herald and the South Florida Sun Sentinel. He is the author of the Last Seasons in Cuba, Last Seasons in Havana, which he's going to talk to us about today, and Havana Hardball, Spring Training, Jackie Robinson, and the Cuban League. César also won the 2020 SABR Research Award for Last Season in Havana. César, thanks for joining us tonight, and I'm glad we worked through our technological issues.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that and the delay and everything. So let me see if I can share my screen here, because I've only now got my little laptop instead of two big monitors. So let's see what happens. Host disabled, participant screen sharing.
Yeah, let me give you the ability to do that. What is going on? All of a sudden, the meeting controls have gone away. Oh, here we go.
You should be able to just hover over the little three dots above César.
Yeah.
Well, maybe make him a host.
Yep, that's what I'm doing. There we go.
Co-host.
Okay, so now let's see. Share screen options. One participant can share screen at a time. But I don't see a button just for sharing my screen.
I think on the bottom there's an option to just share screen.
Yeah, I don't see it now. It says security where it used to say share screen. There it is. But it's not doing it. You know, maybe I should just talk through this and
Let's
and
go.
not
Let's
worry
go
about
there. That
What's that?
technology gods are not on our side.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's just do that. I've got my script over on the other screen, so I can go through it that way and just kind of talk about it. So, you know, as you mentioned, I've written a couple of books on Cuban baseball history, Havana Hardball and Last Seasons in Havana. And, you know, I wrote Havana Hardball focuses on the mid to late 1940s. It's when Cuba is at the epicenter of events that are going to impact all the Latin leagues, Major League Baseball and Negro leagues for years going forward. And Last Seasons in Havana focuses on the 50s and into the early 60s and the impact that Castro Revolution had on baseball in Cuba. You know, I wrote the two books in large part because of my dad, who, when I was a kid, would tell me about all the American players who would come in the winter and play in Cuba's Winter League, and players that would go on to the Hall of Fame, like Monty Urban and Tommy Lasorda and Ray Dandridge, and also a lot of minor leaguers like Dodgers minor leaguer Kevin Connors, who became much more famous as Chuck Connors, the Hollywood actor. You know, and as a sports writer, when I first got started in Florida, I started to track down some of these retired players with the idea that eventually I might want to write a book. And when I discovered that Robinson's historic 1947 season actually began with spring training in Cuba, I was hooked. Not only on learning about the Cuban League, but Jackie Robinson as well. And that's what led to that first book. So two main storylines in Havana Hardball, the Cuban League 1946-47 season ends with an epic 3-game series between Havana and Almendares, the league's eternal rivals. And as that season is wrapping up, the Brooklyn Dodgers arrive in Havana with Jackie Robinson. They had chosen, Branch Rickey specifically had chosen Cuba because it had a much more tolerant racial climate than Jim Crow Florida, where they had trained the previous season. The Cuban League had been integrated since 1900 and didn't have the sort of codified segregation that was present in the U.S. Now, that's not to say that Cuba was some sort of racial utopia. For example, like the amateur leagues in Cuba were under the purview of social clubs and social societies, and blacks were not allowed membership. Mini Mignoso is one of the players that I write about in the first book, and in his autobiography, he understood the discrimination in Cuba, and he wrote, quote, "Discrimination and segregation were very much alive and flourishing in the Cuba of my birth." He was born in a sugar mill town, and sugar mills were very separated along racial lines, with usually white owners of European descent and the workers, black workers of African descent. But in professional baseball, it was pretty much a meritocracy, and you had in the 1930s managers, black managers like Lázaro Salazar and Martín de Higo, managing teams, winning pennants. I mentioned Mignoso. He began playing in the 45-46 season, which is when Havana Hardball opens that book, and so it's right after World War II, and players are going to Cuba to get themselves prepared to go back to the major leagues after being in the war. Among them was Dick Sisler, the son of future Hall of Famer George Sisler, sort of an instant legend in the Cuban League. Just the one season he played, hitting 3 home runs in the cavernous La Tropical ballpark. But La Tropical, which was built in 1930 and was sort of set up for, you could play soccer. It was so cavernous because they had beer gardens, and it was the sprawling complex, but really old and just not baseball only. So Bobby Maduro built El Gran Stadium of Havana to give Cuba, Havana specifically, a baseball only stadium. And he did this with the goal, hopefully, of luring Major League Baseball eventually to Havana. And so the Cuban League, they move into El Gran Stadium in 46-47 with the 4 teams: Havana, Almendares, Marianao, and Cienfuegos. Those teams are managed by 4 iconic former Cuban players: Martín de Higo, Adolfo Luque, Miguel Ángel González, and Armando Marsans. And as I mentioned, as that wraps up, the Dodgers arrive with Robinson, Roy Campanella, Don Newcomb, and Roy Partlow as members of their minor league team, the Montreal Royals. The previous spring in Florida, there was all kinds of backlash to Robinson's presence, padlock stadiums, mysterious last-minute lighting malfunctions at stadiums, laws on the books forbidding blacks and whites from playing together on the same field. But they wouldn't have to worry about any of that in Havana, because Dodgers knew that they wouldn't have to worry about that, because they had trained there in 1941 and 1942 as well. And whenever they came there, they would stay at the opulent Hotel Nacional, which just months before their 47 visit had actually hosted a mob convention organized by Meyer Lansky. But the Royals, they stayed and trained in the Havana Military Academy outside the city, but Robinson and his black teammates were relegated to a seedy hotel in Old Havana and had to be transported back and forth to the training camp. Robinson was not happy about this. His quote was, "I thought we left Florida to train in Cuba so we could get away from Jim Crow. But it wasn't any sort of law in Cuba that was doing that. It was Branch Rickey, I guess, out of just trying to make sure that there would be no overly concerned that there might be any issues whatsoever, which didn't really make sense given that Robinson had already trained with the Royals and spent the entire season with the Royals. But anyway, aside from those accommodations, Robinson also had to deal with, learning a new position, DeRocha's continued absence throughout spring training, and the players' petition against him led by Dixie Walker. So the two storylines I mentioned, the league and Robinson in Cuba, also play out against the backdrop of the Mexican League sort of rating players from the major leagues. And that's important because as Jorge Pascal, the president of the Mexican League, is convincing about 20 players to jump their contracts, the Cuban League kind of gets wrapped up in this. Among the players that they had rated were Max Lanier and Sal Magli, Danny Gardella, but they also took attempts to try and sign Bob Feller, Phil Rizzuto, Stan Musial. Obviously, those efforts didn't work, but it freaked out the Major League Organized Baseball enough that Happy Chandler decreed that anybody who jumped their contracts would be banned from baseball for at least 5 years. And because so many players in the Cuban League had played with or against some of these jumpers, that he branded the Cuban League a rogue circuit. So Havana Hardball kind of chronicles these conflicts and how they get resolved and what it means moving forward. And then, so that leads to my second book, Last Seasons of Havana, where it kind of picks up where Havana Hardball left off. Robinson's breaking of the color barrier means that now Black Cuban players are able to join the majors. Players like I mentioned, Mignoso and Tony Gonzalez, Carlos Paula. The pact with organized baseball eventually also leads to the formation of the Caribbean Series. And it sets forth the rules going forward by which these the Cuban teams, can sign players from America. And you see guys like Hoyt Wilhelm and Don Zimmer, Dick Williams, Joe Black playing in the Cuban League throughout the 50s. Now, last season, it focuses on those last few seasons of the Cuban League and also the Havana Sugar Kings, the AAA team, amid the upheaval of the Castro Revolution. And while the book it's not a political book, it does tell the baseball story in the context of the political turmoil and upheaval going on in Cuba, because it would have been impossible to really tell the story of baseball those last years, professional baseball those last years, without also explaining all of the political upheaval that was going on in Cuba in the late 50s and early 60s. And that upheaval, the Castro Revolution, it divided families, friends, neighbors. And in my family, my grandfather was one of 11 siblings, and 5 of his siblings were communists, became communist, and so there was a great deal of friction. And the family members who didn't support the revolution were ostracized from the rest of the family. So the revolution really tore through the whole fabric of Cuban society, including baseball, which was the country's national pastime. In fact, baseball and revolution had been linked in Cuba going back to their fight for independence from Spain in the 1890s. Some of the baseball pioneers in Cuba actually fought for independence and gave their lives for that cause. And for the Cuban people, choosing baseball over bullfighting was one expression of rejecting, one way to express their rejection of Spanish colonial rule. And of course, the U.S. became deeply involved in Cuba's war for independence with the sinking of the Maine and Havana Harbor, Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, as the Cuba's war for independence morphed into the Spanish-American War. But even with independence, Cuba's history was pretty tortured as a constitutional republic. It sort of lurched back and forth from U.S. occupation and intervention to questionable elections, corrupt administrations, political violence, and that eventually led to Fulgencio Batista's bloodless coup in 1952. But despite all that, the Cuban League was able to march on. Minor league baseball came to Havana in 1947 with the Class B Havana Cubans. And Maduro eventually bought them and moved them to AAA as the Sugar Kings. And the team motto was un paso más y llegamos, one more step and we get there. One more step being, of course, the majors, not just for the players in AAA, but in Maduro's hopes for a team in Havana. But as the Sugar Kings were just getting started, that's when Castro begins his revolution in 1956 in the Sierra Maestra mountain range in Cuba's eastern province. But since the fighting was largely outside of Havana, the Cuban League was able to continue uninterrupted, although as the rebellion destabilized the Batista regime, the fear started to build among U.S. observers. The Eisenhower administration struggled with what they were going to do, how they were going to deal with Batista and Castro. There were contingency plans for possibly moving the Sugar Kings, and American teams and debated whether or not to allow, major league teams debated whether or not to allow American players from continuing to play in the Cuban League. Finally, Batista fled in January 1, 1959, and Castro was welcomed as a hero when he came into Havana several days later. And for the most part, organized baseball thought that they had passed the worst, and Bobby Maduro was convinced that better days lay ahead. But you started to see scenes of gun-toting rebels became a common sight at the Cuban League and Sugar Kings games, and the optimism started to give way to fear as the revolution started to morph into communism, and you started to see citizens being rounded up. My own uncle was one, and it was spent a month in La Cabaña prison. He was able to eventually get out, but others weren't as fortunate. And as the Castro for 2 years ratcheted up anti-U.S. rhetoric, and he expropriated land and confiscated businesses, both U.S. and Cuban owned. And eventually those tensions escalated to the point where Cuba, like leaving the future of baseball in Cuba in professional baseball in Cuba in serious doubt. And the last hurrah for the Sugar Kings came in 1959, dramatic 7-game series in the Junior World Series that included a 20-year-old minor leaguer named Carl Yastrzemski. But by the next year, halfway through the season, the Sugar Kings were relocated to Jersey City, and Maduro's hope for an expansion team in Cuba pretty much ended there. Eventually, Ford Frick banned American players from participating in the 60-61 Cuban League season. That season was played with an entirely Cuban rosters on all 4 teams for the first time in decades. And right after the season, Cuba officially outlawed professionalism in sports in the country. After that season, despite all the tensions, a lot of players were able to leave and join their major league teams, but they faced the choice of, do they stay here and maybe never return to Cuba, or come back to Cuba and probably never be able to continue their major league careers? So when I talked to Luis Tiant for the second book, he told me, he was told by his dad, don't come back, when he was, I guess at that point in Mexico, because he told him that if you come back home, you'll probably never be able to leave. And in fact, he wasn't able to reunite with them for another 15 years during the 75 World Series. And he told me, you have to be Cuban to understand what we've been through. And I I do understand that. My family had to flee in 1965 when I was 5 months old. There was one review that said the history of baseball in Cuba and the events that resulted in Fidel Castro's power grab in 1959 that concluded that I take that very personally, and so I would agree with that. But anyway, that's kind of the take of what the book was about. Those two books are about. I wish I could have shown you the photos because they're pretty amazing. That I put some of them they're in the book if you've seen the book. But if you guys, I'll be glad to open it up to any questions if you have any.
Cesar, why did Castro outlaw professionalism? What was the logic behind that at the time?
Well, there was a point where he was even working with Maduro to try to keep the Sugar Kings there. He took, I think, offense to the fact that they relocated the team in the middle of the season. But really, they were already going, I think at that point, he may have already declared that it was a socialist revolution. They were appropriating land, they were taking over businesses. Professional baseball may have been the last sort of independent business owned but not by the government. But basically, he turned everything into sort of a Soviet model of sports, which is what you saw post-revolution. All those teams from Cuba that's played in whether the Olympics or any other international competition, it was kind of modeled on that Soviet model of athletics.
Got it. How
Did Minnie Minoso, once he left, was he ever back to Cuba? Whatever. I mean, I know he was a great player, but whatever happened with his Cuban roots, or
he was among the many players who never went back because basically players who left, they knew that if they even ever tried to come back, they'd never be able probably to get to leave Cuba. Certainly in those times, somebody like Luis Tiant, he finally went back. I forget what year it was, but in the 2000s, I think there was like a documentary that he did with his visit. But no, Minoso and most of those players never went back to Cuba at all.
They never went back after 1960, or they? So I thought Minoso went back a few times to play winter ball in the mid 50s with.
Well, yeah, no, he played up until the final season, 61-60.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was after that when
He never went back after that. Okay.
Right, like the players who right after that season, the ones who were able to leave, they actually had to leave through Mexico because at that point there wasn't diplomatic relations between Cuba and the U.S. So they had to go to Mexico, and there in Mexico, their visas to get to the U.S. to go back to their major league teams. That's where they were waiting for them, and then they could continue on.
I recall a story that Sandy Amoros, Brooklyn Dodgers left fielder, was Cuban. Was Cuban. I guess he's deceased. And he would take all his earnings and invest in cattle ranches in Cuba and live there in the off season. And then somewhere along the line, Castro saying, you can't go back to America. You have to stay here to be the manager of the Cuban nationals team. Whatever that really is, I don't really know. But he somehow fled and went back to the United States to play a year or two or more. Were there other people like that who were saying, if you stay here, you have to go working for this or that?
Well, like somebody like let's say Fermin Guerra, who played briefly in the majors, was a Cuban League star, a catcher, manager. He didn't leave, and he ended up managing the the sort of reconstituted national series. He managed Oriente, I think was the name of the team. So I've seen photos of him managing after 61 what became the Serie Nacional, the national series in Cuba. So yeah, I mean there are examples like that of guys who didn't leave, and Martin de Higo stayed in Cuba, and he was some sort of sports dignitary in the government for a while, and before eventually stopping that. But yeah, like it was pretty much like you go back or you stay here and maybe never go back.
Caesar, do you have a sense of did the Cuban leagues pay better than, say, Puerto Rican winter leagues or the Dominican? Why would people? I'm just curious. Why go to Cuba and play versus Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I don't know, like compared like one league to another what they paid. If I remember right, I think like Monty Irvin said something like they would be paid like, I want to say $4,000 a month, which sounds like it would probably be a pretty decent salary in the 40s and 50s. But they were also they put them up for they would put them up in a they had set them up in a place to live. A lot of them in the 50s, there was a sort of a beach resort called Club Náutico, and that's where a lot of the players would stay. So it was kind of like a vacation in that sense, right? Like the Cuban League would only play maybe 3 or 4 days a week, doubleheader on Sundays, and then 2 or 3 days during the week, depending on the schedule. All the 4 teams played in the same stadium in the same city, all against each other. So there was no travel whatsoever. So you had a lot of downtime, and a lot of players would bring their families with them. It was kind of a mini vacation where they got to be paid to play baseball. And this is a time when you don't have a lot of superstars making monstrous salaries, right? So a lot of these players, if once the season ended, they would have to go get like a real off-season job, like working at a hardware store or whatever. But if you had the chance to go ahead and play baseball and be treated pretty well, it was a good deal. Like Don Zimmer, he was as he put it, freezing his took us off in Cincinnati, I think it was, when he got a call. Hey, do you want to come down to Cuba and play shortstop? They need somebody. So he would jump at the chance.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say that I enjoyed your book immensely, and it was so informative and about Cuba and about the revolution, as well as about all the individual ball players, and some great stories in there.
Thank you.
I guess I became a little interested in Cuban baseball when I started looking at the Comelas Deportes baseball cards. And I saw the guys that had been banned from from Major League Baseball with cards there, Sal Magli, Lanier, and those guys. But I also saw Dick Sisler, and you mentioned Dick Sisler. I wonder if you want to share this the Hemingway connection with Dick Sisler. Are you aware of that one? Or
I think I saw something about it, but I don't remember all the details about it.
The very famous book by Hemingway, one of his, is called The Old Man and the Sea.
Oh,
And
actually, yeah, he makes a reference to the game where he hits the 3 home runs.
exactly.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
fisherman says, he'll never forget Dick Sisler because of the home runs he hit at the stadium there in Havana and all. And that was just marvelous things that went on in.
And I think there's a couple of other references to the Cuban League in Old Man and the Sea as well.
Yes, he does mention. He mentions
Gonzalez
and
Luque.
Correct, exactly. And it's so tragic, the relationship between the United States and Cuba over a century has been so complex that it really surprised me, I guess. In many ways, not, I'm sure you know a lot more about it than from your family and all too, but it struck me how closely tied we were at one time, good and bad, and what's transpired since. And so I want to thank you for the book. Book was wonderful.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. You mentioned Hemingway. There's all sorts of baseball Hemingway connections in Cuba. When the Dodgers were down there, and this is in Havana Hardball, and they were down there in 42, he invited several of them out to his farm and there was quite a bit of drinking. At some point, he challenged one of the players to a boxing match.
Sounds like Hemingway.
that degenerated, as you might expect, to the point even where once they stopped it all, a very drunk Hemingway challenged one of them to a duel the next morning and ended up embarrassed the next day going to the ballpark to apologize. And there's a book about Hemingway in Cuba that mentions how he was a fan of the Havana team and followed Vinegar Ben Mizell had a sort of a really outstanding winter down there one year where he set all kinds of records, set a major record with strikeouts down there for a short season. So there's quite a few Hemingway connections. But yeah, the ties, the baseball ties between Cuba and the U.S. run deep. I mean, baseball, the Winter League started in 1878, just 2 years after the National League was formed here. Baseball was introduced to Cuba in the 1860s by Cuban students returning from having studied here for college and then bringing the game to Cuba. So long, deep ties that were severed in 1960.
So non sequitur, who is the guy on the book cover who's holding that machine gun? Or that gun?
Cleveland Browns catcher, Dick Brown. Of course, now I'm drawing a blank. His last name is Brown. Let me see if I can. But yeah, he played for Almendares.
And he was a major leaguer?
Yeah, I think he was at least briefly with the Browns. I mean the Browns, the Indians.
Oh, okay. St. Louis Brown.
His name was Brown, but I can't now remember his first name. Dan Brown? I don't. Dick Brown.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah, Dick Brown, I think.
Dick Brown. Okay.
Cleveland Indians, White Sox, Tigers, Orioles. Yeah, so kind of a journeyman, but
great picture.
Hey, Cesar, I see a few collectibles behind you there. I think it's a team photo of the Almendares team.
Yeah.
I'm a big, got into the Negro League history, and that kind of drew me to Cuban and Puerto Rican baseball because there were no cards of the Negro League players from American companies. So you had to get the, Deportivos or the Alertas, or, one of my favorite,
those big pamphlets that they were having.
Interesting story behind those, but so that kind of sucked me into the Cuban and Puerto Rican, the winter ball, and even created my own Facebook page for that. And it turns out there's a lot more fans out there than I realized.
Yeah, there's a ton. I've got probably hundreds of original prints of photos from the 40s and 50s, and
Really?
some few from the 30s that were but from newspapers and magazines in Cuba at the time that somehow made their way here post-revolution. You find them on auction sites and eBay and all that stuff.
It was a little easier pre-COVID, and then of course with the Negro Leaguers, they got a lot more attention when they got elevated to major league status.
Yep.
So those collectibles went up and harder to find and more expensive if you can find them.
Yeah, the photo back here is actually like from an insert in a magazine. It is like sort of the centerfold of a magazine, and they would do that for team photos all the time. There were tons of publications, like a dozen newspapers covering the league, and multiple magazines that covered sports in the 40s and 50s in
I
Cuba.
think I have that one. Is that the one with Monty Irvin in it?
Photos is one of, yeah, Photos was a black and white magazine, and there's one cover that has Monty Irvin's face on it that's pretty well known.
Cesar, were there any specific challenges you had with researching the last season's book, or people that you wanted to speak with that didn't want to speak with you?
Yeah, I mean, most guys were pretty forthcoming, willing to talk. Sometimes it was just a question of hard to track them down. The one guy that I just really wished I could have gotten was Camilo Pascual. I had a number for him, kept calling, it would go to voicemail, but you couldn't leave a message. He's a pretty private guy. And I tried just every way I could think of. And if I could have just gotten him on the phone, I know he would have talked, because in fact, there's a guy who just finished a book about Joe Cambria, and I gave him his phone number, and like me, he tried and tried, had no luck, and one day he happened to answer the phone, and he talked to him for like 20 minutes. So I was happy for him, but jealous from because I wasn't able to. So there were some guys that I couldn't talk to. I would have liked to have gotten Lasorda. He declined, but fortunately he wrote about his experiences in a couple books, so I was able to reference those. I sort of last minute was able to get Pedro Ramos, because I think he like owns like a cigar farm in Nicaragua or something. So he's very hard to get a hold of, but he happened at some point, he was in Miami. So I was able to get a number for him, and I got him, and he's like, listen, call me on my Miami cell phone. You called my Nicaraguan cell phone. So I can only imagine what that bill would have been like. So, I had people helping me. Sometimes I stumbled upon people in my first, when I was doing a book event for the first one in Miami, a guy walks up and he shows me his phone, and there's a picture of a little kid, which turns out to be him in an Almendares uniform on the field with Roberto Ortiz. And we started talking, and his family went to Jersey City, and he ended up being a bat boy for the Sugar Kings when they went to. So he's in the last seasons of Havana, and there was a SABR convention in Miami where I was on a panel, and Jorge Maduro, Bobby Maduro, one of his sons, came up afterwards and introduced himself. So I was able to get a lot of stuff from him. So, that was the biggest challenge, I guess, was just, finding folks or trying to find numbers for folks. But fortunately, I was able to get a lot of them.
Hey, Cesar, tell me about the style of play of Cuban League. What with it, the way it developed on its own, and perhaps with the injection of American talent, what was its style of play?
Well, remember, like in the in the 20s, 30s, you had these stadiums with really essentially no fences, or the fence is so far away that you're not going to hit home runs. So a lot of so probably bunting, base stealing, more than the power, home runs, that type of thing, until they moved to El Gran Stadium. In fact, we talked about Dick Sisler. One writer wrote about how that moment when Sisler hit those 3 home runs, mammoth home runs at La Tropical, was sort of the first time when Cuban baseball went from, the way he described it, from Cobbian baseball to Ruthian baseball, and this would have been in 1945, 46. I had Ralph Avila, who was the Latin American scouting guy for many years for the Dodgers. He talked about how it was really in the 50s when you had guys managing, when you had like Campanis, believe it or not, managed down there, and Bobby Bragan, that they sort of elevated the play in terms of the fundamentals during the 50s, and you had this a much larger infusion of American players. At that point, you could have, I think it was 8. Each team could have up to 8 players from organized baseball. So, some people took offense to what Avila said about sort of elevating the level of play. These American managers, but he was involved in baseball down there for many years, so I took what he said to be fairly legitimate.
You mentioned somebody in your book was a pitcher, and it was either Camilo Pascual, maybe Ramos, maybe Pena, saying that he learned how to pitch from some of his experience in the major leagues versus more of a thrower in the Cuban league.
Yeah, I mean that's probably true. I mean, and winter ball, it's a short season. You're not having, like I said, you're not playing every day, so they're definitely going to get develop more over a course of 162 game, or at that point, I guess 154 game season.
Was there anything you learned during your research that surprised you? That was something maybe you thought differently, but through your research, it changed either a perspective or a conventional wisdom that you had going into it?
I don't know about changing perspective I might have had going in, because I'd been researching it for, like, when I wrote the book, I'd already been like gathering information for like 15 years. So, but the one really cool thing I found, which I had no idea about when I was doing Havana Hardball, the New York Times had a guy covering the Dodgers throughout spring training that year, and when I'm going through the Times stories, I find this one where in one game down in Cuba, whoever would during batting practice taking infield, whoever was at first at the time got nailed by a batted ball during infield, and Dixie Walker, who owned a sporting goods store in, I guess, Alabama, he fashioned this, basically what we see now as those screens that they put in front of each of the bases and the pitcher, just kind of fashioned one. And apparently it was the first time something like that was ever used. And the story quotes DeRocha saying, "This is fantastic. Like, this is something you're going to see, in every ballpark going forward." So just to find out that something that's so, it's been such a part of the baseball for all these years, that it was invented, I guess, in Cuba by Dixie Walker. I just thought, wow, that's really cool.
Well, I think there's one cool thing I kind of discovered, and I don't know how the guys that from the Tidewater, the Bud Metheny group here, realize that the Sugar Kings moved to Jersey City first, right?
Right.
And then they went down to Jacksonville, I understand.
Right.
And their next stop was Portsmouth, Virginia. So the Norfolk Tides have a direct relationship with the Havana Cuban Sugar Kings.
Yeah, that franchise had to do a lot of moving.
Yeah.
Yeah, you wonder how they came upon Portsmouth to pick back in the 50s, right? I guess it would have been the 50s.
And they were taking the spot of, I think Springfield, was because there were two teams added the year that the Sugar Kings joined the International League in 54, or 56, actually. And might have been 54, but yeah, they were taking the spot of, I think it was Springfield at the time, but it was the Havana Cubans of the Florida International League that Maduro bought and shifted to AAA.
All right. Any other questions for Cesar this evening?
Any idea what's going to happen in the future with regards to Cuba and baseball? Whether there's any possibility of professional baseball there again, any possibility of relationships again with the United States in that arena?
You know,
Especially after watching the WBC and all.
it's hard to say. I mean, you know, it's now no longer a thing, but there was a time when the guy who had owned it's now Wichita, and it used to be the baby cakes, or the right in New Orleans, right, I think.
Yeah.
And he was also at even before then, I think, Pawtucket. But he and his group owned the territorial rights to Havana, and they were making efforts to try and potentially in the future have a minor league team in Havana. And this was an effort that was going on through multiple administrations, from the Bush, Clinton, Obama. And then when he actually passed away because of COVID, and sort of all those efforts, you know, they had a foundation that was doing outreach in Cuba, basically like grassroots kind of level, in terms, you know, like help fixing up fields, providing equipment to youth leagues, that sort of thing, to as they say, build bridges. But when Lou passed away in the middle of COVID, and COVID just even stopped all of their charitable, the foundation work too. And I think it all just kind of went away. And then obviously, you know, when, you know, things looked like they might be going in that direction, when they had the agreement between MLB and the Cuban Baseball Federation that was then nixed under the Trump administration. You know, I don't know. You know, then they reorganized minor league baseball, so there's now those territorial rights are no longer a thing. You know, probably in the current system. I just don't know. I haven't seen anything yet as far as the Biden administration in terms of trying to sort of revamp or bring that agreement back into play. So it's probably, given everything else going on, I'm sure it's not high on the priority list. But
Well, they
What's
could take a page from the Savannah team and start the Havana Bananas. Just, you know, good marketing. Just,
Yeah.
we'll give
What's the state of baseball in Cuba today?
it's not what it was. You know, we're talking about 15 years now of them really hemorrhaging talent. You know, it had been defections mostly, right? Guys escaping any way they could, hiring smugglers to get out. But about 10 years ago, Cuba made it easier for people to leave legally. You know, just everybody, any citizen, basically. Although there were supposed to be exceptions for certain, you know, doctors, scientists, athletes, that it would be harder for them to get clearance to leave. But you know, but what seems to be happening now is that basically what they are finding ways to pay to be able to get unblocked to leave. They're leaving legally in the sense that the Cuban government gives them permission to leave. They still have to go, you know, through a third country, but they're, you know, they're not having to escape in a, you know, boat in the middle of the night and all the risks that go with it. They can actually leave legally. So, you know, I haven't seen, it doesn't seem like there's any stopping of the talent leaving. There's a guy, Francis Romero, who sort of tracks on his Twitter feed all the signings. He wrote a book about how basically every Cuban player has left the island since the revolution. And it goes year by year and details how each guy left, the circumstances and everything. And if you look at his Twitter feed, like, you know, every, you know, there's a constant posting of, you know, this player left, this player was granted free agency, this player signed, and it's just constant. So the even if they're leaving legally, it is not. The flood of talent leaving has not slowed at all. I think you see that like in the World Baseball Classic. If the World Baseball Classic had been held in the 90s, Cuba would probably be one of the dominant teams, one of the favorites to win, and they're really not any, and haven't been in those tournaments.
Is there a professional league there now?
No,
Or-
it's not a professional league, and the way the Serie Nacional is set up, that each province, and I think there's like 15 provinces now. It used to be just 5 or 6, but each province has a provincial team, and they play in the series, in the national series, and then those provincial teams feed the national team that you see, in the World Baseball Classic or in the Olympics or any sort of international competition. But it is. I mean, they are paid, whatever, but the salaries are, Cuba doesn't have the kind of money to pay salaries. They do allow players to go play in Japan or South Korea or wherever, and then some of that money probably goes back to the government. Is it a profession? I mean, to me, Peter Barkman would say if your full-time job is being a player, you're a professional. And that's one of the criteria, but I also think part of being professional is having some choices and deciding where you want to play. And it's much better now, but it's not like they can just say, oh, I'll just go here to play. I mean, but they do have a little more leeway to move around than they did before now, because they changed their immigration policy and people can leave.
Got it. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, Cesar, thank you for joining us tonight. Very interesting. I echo Carl's comments about the book. I thought it was very, I learned a lot from it. I've always had an interest in Cuban baseball, and that really, I thought, laid out, the history from the revolution and how things came together and stopped when Castro came into power. So thank you for researching that and sharing your knowledge with us tonight.
Well, thank you, and I apologize for all the technical difficulties and the delay. So I'm really sorry about that.
Not an issue. It happens to everyone at some time or another.
Have you been back to Cuba?
I have not. We left when I was 5 months old, and I have not been back, unfortunately. I'm dying to go.
Okay. All right.
All right,
Last
everyone. Any other questions? If not, have a good evening. Thanks again, Cesar.
All right, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.